Okay, so we'll get started. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go over the homework from last week. I know a lot of you had questions on it, and it was probably difficult because one part, I guess you guys didn't learn about casting, but I'll go over that and I'll go over an alternative which you guys could have done. So because of that kind of like confusion, we'll grade like a bit easier this time. So as long as you like attempted it, we'll give you like the amount that you need to pass this week. So let me share my screen and we'll go over the answers. Okay, so these were like your homework problems. If you guys remember, like, I don't know when you guys did it, but just as like a refresher, we're gonna like read over the problems too. So the first problem says, take values of length and breadth of a rectangle from the user and check if it is a square or not. So breadth is basically like a width. So if you guys know about like squares, basically all sides have to be equal, right? So just thinking about this problem, like not worrying about the coding, just worrying about the logic first, the length and the width have to be equal. So that's basically what we're checking. So there's two ways you guys could have done this, like to get the length and the width, because it didn't specify. User input, which we learned about last time, or you guys can like manually type it in what you want the length and the width to be. So let's go to that problem. Okay. Okay. I chose to do like the input way. So first I just have length equals input. What is the length of the shape? So it's just gonna ask the user what is the length of the shape, and it's gonna assign whatever the user puts in into the length, and then same for the width. So as you guys know, like whenever you do like user input, the result is gonna be a string, right? And we didn't learn about casting, so you're not gonna be able to turn that string into an integer. You're not gonna be able to do that. So we're gonna keep them as strings for now. And we're just going to compare the strings. So I'm just going to say if length is equal to width, print the shape is a square. Else print the shape is a square. So it's pretty simple, right? So let's run it. What is the length of the shape? Maybe we can put like 4. What is the width? We can also put 4. And 4 and 4 is equal, right? So you want the output to be the shape is a square, which that's what it says. So that's basically how the if statement works there. And the else is basically saying if it's not equal, then it's going to print the shape is not a square. So another way you could have done this if you didn't want to do the user input way is you could have just like manually assigned variable values to or integer values to length and width. So like you could just do like length equals 4, width equals 4. But like you guys know how to do it the other way too, so that would have been fine either way. So you have shape square. You have to like change it in the program instead of changing it through user input. So any questions on the first problem? I think most of you got this one, but any questions? No? Okay, cool. Then we'll go to the second problem. So the second problem says, write a program to check if a year is a leap year or not. If a year is divisible by 4, then it is a leap year. So that's basically, it tells you like what a leap year is, so you can use that to figure out the logic for the code. So you just want to basically check if the number that either you can do it by user input or manually, if the number you put in is divisible by 4, right? So in this case, you cannot treat it as a string because you cannot check if a string is divisible by something. Does that make sense? Like you have to have a number. So in this case, you have to use casting. But we're gonna learn about that this week. So for those of you who like didn't know that, you could have just like put in a manual value in. So let's look at the code for this one. Okay. So we're basically checking if this year's a leap year or not. So I just like wrote that as a comment at the top. So first, I'm just gonna show you the user input way. So I have year equals, ignore that part for now, I'll explain it later. Input year. So that makes sense to you guys, right? We're basically asking the user and we're putting that, putting what they said into the variable year. And I have this part int, and that's the way I'm gonna turn the string into an integer. So what I did is I just put the value here, the input or the result that the user is gonna put in into like parentheses with this int. And we're gonna go more into this like today, so I'm not gonna go into the detail, but just like this is syntax. And that's gonna change, like that's gonna take the string inside that's returned and turn it into an integer. That's basically called casting. So we'll go more into that today. Okay, And here's the if statement. So like basically the main point of this homework exercise was the if statement. So if you guys got that part, good job. So if year mod 4 is equal 0, remember we did this with the even example. We divided it by 2 to check if it's even, and we wanted the remainder to be 0 or the result to be 0. So that's basically what we're doing here as well. So we're just saying that year mod 4 is equal 0. That basically means the number is divisible by 4, right? And in that case, you're going to print the year is a leap year. Otherwise, you're going to print the year is not a leap year. So that's pretty self-explanatory, right? So we can just do like 2004, and that number is divisible by 4, right? So you want it to print this year as a leap year, and that's what it says. So, but like I'm guessing most of you guys did not know about casting. So what you could have done is just enter like a manual value in for a year, like into the program, like that. So that you just get like that. So that would be an option for that part. Any questions on this one, on this problem? Everybody's good? Okay, cool. So I think the last problem was the one that gave many people trouble. So here it says, ask user to enter age, gender, marital status, and then using the following rules, print their place of service. Okay, so in this case, when it says ask user enter age, because you guys did not know about casting, you could just do that manually. So that's the part that we're gonna kind of grade leniently on. So, and the rest of it, like the gender and the marital status, you guys could have done. Right, and then each of these sub bullets are your conditional statements that you're gonna put into the code, right? So here is the answer or the code that I wrote out. And remember, you guys can always like comment out your code, especially like when you're starting out. It's way easier to comment out your code so you can come back to it and understand too. So they're like notes at the same time. Okay, so age equals int, I did the casting again, int input age, right? So that's basically asking the user. And then gender, input gender, masculine or male or female. So it's really important, like when you're asking the user, if you're only gonna take in 2 outputs or 2 inputs, you wanna specify what they are. Because if the user puts in like male, your program won't work for that, right? So you wanna say M or F so they know what they're gonna, and married, yes or no. So that's basically the user input part. And the second part is the actual conditional statements. So you have if gender equals F, and make sure the F is in strings because you're comparing the strings. You're gonna print urban, and that matches with the first bullet. If employee is female, then she will work in only urban areas. So that's why you're printing urban if gender is female, okay? And then there's an else if, or like elif. Elif gender is masculine, and so it says the age has to be between 20 and 40, right? So that's why you do age greater than 20 and age less than 40 here, okay? And then you have a colon, which is basically the syntax, and then print anywhere, because that's what this condition says, okay? And last one, you have another else if gender is male, between 40 and 60, and you wanna have the and statements here, so it's between them. So I'm saying greater than 40, less than 60 means between. You're gonna print urban. And another really important thing to remember is between means that you're not including the endpoints, right? So that's an important thing. And then else, you're just gonna print error. So let's try an example here. We can maybe enter age 21. Capital M, yes. That's anywhere. That matches with our conditional statements and our conditions in the actual initial problem, right? So because you guys did not know user input, you guys again could have just entered a manual value in. So like age equals 21, like that. So you just asked from gender on male, yeah, anywhere again. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? This problem, does that make more sense now? Any questions?
For number 2, somebody asked if instead of just like putting 2004, if they could put like a random int.
Yeah, you can do that. And we'll go more into that later because I think that many of you are doing like a password generator or like a random number game or something like that. So you guys will need to know random. So we're gonna go into that later, but good point, you brought it up. So it's a good introduction. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, if there's no more questions, then that was it for the homework. And then we're gonna start learning about week 3 material. So let me stop sharing. Okay.
Okay, so for week 3, we're doing loops and intro to functions. Next week, we'll be writing functions, but I'm just gonna like introduce some built-in functions you can use. Okay, so what is a loop and why do we use them? A loop can repeat the same block of code. So let's say that we want to print a statement 10 times instead of printing in an individual, instead of printing 10 individual print statements, we can make a loop that repeats a single print statement 10 times. And then we can also use loops to go through or iterate through a sequence, such as a string or a list. Lists are something we're going to be going over in week 5. And since loops can be used for repeating code, it'll make your programming more efficient. Okay, for loops. For loops is used for iterating over a sequence. This is especially useful for lists. And a for loop can iterate over characters in a string. So here we have an example of a for loop. So first, you'll need to write the keyword for, and then your iterator, or a variable you're going to iterate through the sequence. So in that case, we're using x. And then we're going to have our keyword in, and then our iteratable sequence, which in this case is the string hello. And then we also have a colon after our for loop statement. And then when we press enter, that's where we're going to write our block of code. And make sure this is indented so you know that it's inside the for loop. And in this case, we're just going to write a simple print statement, x. So that's basically going to, so x basically represents each character in the string. So I'm going to, and it's going to print each character of the string in a new line. Okay. So as you can see, it prints each character of the string on a new line because x represents each character in the string. Okay, while loops run the same block of code until a certain Boolean expression is met. This is useful for when you want to run the same code a certain amount of times or until a statement is true or false. So here we have an example. We're initializing x to 0, and then we're going to go into our while loop. So for our while loop, we want to have the keyword while and a Boolean expression. In this case, we're going to have x is less than or equal to 25. So this loop will keep on repeating until as long as x is less than or equal to 25. After our while statement, we also have to have a colon, and then we go into our block of code that we want to be repeated. So now we're going to print x, and then we're going to add 5 to x each time. So basically, we're starting off with x being 0. The Boolean expression is true, so we're going to go into our code. We're going to print 0, and we're going to add 5 to 0, so now x is 5. We're going to test our Boolean expression. It still holds true. We're going to print 5, and we're going to add 5 to x, so now x is 10, and it's going to keep on doing that until x is 25, so I'll show it here. Okay. So as you can see, it prints until x is greater than 25. So even when x is equal to 25, this Boolean expression is still true, so it's still going to print 25. But if we take out the equal sign, when x is 25, the loop is going to terminate because x needs to be less than 25. So as you can see, 25 isn't printed. So now that you know a little bit of how while loops work, do you think you could tell me how many times good job is going to be printed in the next example? Yeah, it's going to be printed 6 times. I'll show how. So I'm going to comment this out. As you can see, it's printed 6 times. Okay. Infinite loops. So infinite loops are loops that run forever, and this happens when the Boolean expression of a while loop is never met. Make sure you guys don't use these because they're super impractical. So here is an example. So we're first initializing our variable x to 0, and then we have our while loop statement. So the while loop will keep on running until x is less than -1. But since we're incrementing x by 1 each time, x is never going to be less than -1, so the loop is going to run forever. Okay, nested loops. Nested loops are a loop inside of a loop. You guys don't need to know these as much, but I just want to add this in here. So basically, we're initializing 2 variables. We're initializing I to 1 and j to 5. And then we have our nested while loop. So make sure that the while loop inside of that outer while loop is indented to show that it's nested. And then I also want you to note that we're concatenating with a comma instead of a plus sign so that we can concatenate an integer to a string. So basically, these 2 Boolean expressions are going to be tested simultaneously. So they're going to be incremented at the same time and they're going to be tested at the same time. So I'll show that too. So as you can see, we print 1 and 5. We add 1 to both. We check to see if both Boolean expressions still hold true. They do, so we print I and j again, but now it's 2 and 6. We add 1 to both, so now they're 3 and 7. They're still true in the Boolean expression, so we print 3 and 7. We add 1 to each, so now it's going to be 4 and 8. But since 4 is not less than 4 and 8 is not less than 8, the loop is going to terminate.
Can you go back to infinite loops for a minute?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And also, somebody asked if when you're printing a for loop, like, is there a way to print all of the output like on the same line, or is it just always going to be on a separate line?
It's always going to be on a separate line because of how print statements work. So once you print something, it automatically goes to the new line. Okay.
If you want to make it on the same line, instead of printing it out, maybe store it all in a string and then print the string at the end. So that would be one way to do it if you want to print it in one line.
Also, like for loops are definitely more useful for lists. And since we haven't done that yet, I was just showing an example of how a for loop can be used, but they're definitely like more useful for lists. Are those all the questions?
Somebody just wants you to go over infinite loops like again.
Okay. So I don't recommend running this, but I just wanted to show you how like infinite loops are just loops that run forever. And that's when the Boolean expression is not met. So like, since we're adding one each time and the Boolean expression for the while statement is while x is greater than -1, this Boolean expression is always going to be true. So like the loop is never going to terminate at some point. Is that clear?
So is there like, there's probably, somebody asked if there's any way at all to use infinite loops like for the project, but
No, like you shouldn't really use them at all. I just wanted to show you what they are. Okay, so now we're going to talk about break and continue statements. These are like really useful keywords for loops. So a break is a keyword used to exit a for or while loop while the condition is still true. And a continue statement skips the current block of code and goes to the for or while statement. So in this example where we use the break, okay, I'm gonna, so this while loop is intended to run until I is equal to 6. But since we have an if statement here, when I is equal to 3, it breaks. The loop is just going to terminate when I is equal to 3. So I is equal to 1. This while loop is still true. So it prints I. We increment I by 1, so I is 2. This while loop is still true. We print 2. We add 1 to I again, so now I is 3. This while loop is still true. We print 3, but this if statement is true and the while loop breaks, so it completely terminates. And then for for continue statements, we see that it actually skips 3. So when we start this, we have I initialized to 0, and we have that same while statement, I is less than 6. We first add 1 to I. We check if I is equal to 3, and since it's not, we just print I, and then we check if this Boolean expression is true. 1 is less than 6, so it's true. We add 1 to I, so I is now 2. This if statement is still not true, so we skip over that, and we print I, and then we go back to the top. This while statement is still true because 2 is less than 6. We add 1 to 2, so now I is 3. But this if statement is true, so we continue. So instead of printing I, we go straight to the while statement and continue this loop until the Boolean expression is false. Okay, so now we have an in-class exercise. So write a program that prints the amount of numbers between 1 and 100 inclusive that are divisible by 3 and 5. So we need to think about what kind of loop we should use, what conditional statements we should use to check if a number is divisible by 3 and 5, and how we're going to get the amount of numbers between 1 and 100 that are divisible by 3 and 5. So I would say that you need to have a variable, and you need to increment that variable by 1 every time a number between 1 and 100 are divisible by 3 and 5. So I'll give you like 5 minutes to do this. Do you guys understand what you're supposed to be doing? Because I have.
So if the number is divisible by 3 and 5, do we count it twice?
No, so you're just counting it once if it's divisible by 3 and 5.
Okay, thanks.
Also, if you guys need to refer to the PowerPoint, it's on Google Classroom too. Okay, so I'll just go over how to do it now. So knowing that we want to check all the numbers from 1 to 100 inclusive, we are going to assign 1 to a variable. So I'm just picking the variable n. And then I'm also initializing a counter. So the purpose for this variable is to basically count when the number n is divisible by 3 and by 5. So for our while statement, since we want to check all the numbers from 1 to 100, our Boolean expression is going to be n is less than or equal to 100. So basically, this is going to run until n is greater than 100. So in our while loop, we want to write an if statement. And to see if a number is divisible by 3 and 5, we use the modulus operator and we see if it's equal to 0. So basically it's checking if the remainder of the number divided by 3 is equal to 0. So we have that for 3 and we have that for 5. So we're checking if 3 and 5 if the number is divisible by 3 and 5. So we need to have our and logical operator in the if statement. And then if this is true, we're just going to increment our counter by 1. So this is going to count if the number is divisible by 3 and 5. And then to go on to the next number, we increment n by 1 as well to check the next number in our range from 1 to 100. And then after this while loop is done, we just print our variable counter, because this keeps it stored how many numbers from 1 to 100 are divisible by 3 and 0. So if we run this, you should have gotten 6. I'll show, maybe what I'll do is I'll show which ones. So I'll comment this out, which ones are divisible by. So we're just going to print and instead. So this shows the actual numbers that are divisible by 3 and 5 from 1 to 100. Are there any questions? Okay. Okay, so this is our homework. It's also going to be posted on Google Classroom. And then now I'm going to be introducing functions. So a function is a block of code that can only be executed when it is called. Functions usually have parameters, which is a way for the user to pass in data to the function. And functions can also return a data of specified type as well. So this can be an integer, a float, a string, and other data types. To call a function, you apply the format, the function name, and then 2 parentheses after. So let's say we have a function called add. To call it, you would just write add and then 2 parentheses after it. And then if the function has a parameter, you put the parameter in parentheses. So such as the function name and in parentheses the parameter, or we can have multiple parameters. So then you would just list all the parameters that are needed. So if we had that same function add, but this time it had parameters, we just put our 2 integer parameters in between the parentheses. And once you run the called function, it'll execute. So there are a lot of built-in functions we can use. Most of them are used for typecasting, so such as like the int function. This can change a float to an integer or a string to an integer. We can also use the float function, which will change an integer to a float or a string to a float. And then we also have the string function, which can change an integer to a string or a float into a string. And then we also have our input function, which waits for the user to input a string. And also make sure the input function only accepts strings. So if the user inputs a number and you want to manipulate that number in any way, you would have to convert that into an integer or a float. So in our example, so we have two inputs, enter a number and enter another number. We are storing that into two string variables. And then since we want to manipulate those two numbers, we are going to convert them into integers, and then we're storing that into a new variable. You don't have to store it into a new variable, but I'm just showing it here. And then, so now we're going to run it. I'm just entering a number and then entering another number. And as you can see, it prints the sum of the number. But if we aren't going to convert it, I'll show.
Can people please stop messing with the screen, please? Thank you.
So as you can see, 5 plus 6 it turns out it's 56 because the code thinks since they are strings, it just concatenates those two strings. But if we want to multiply and we don't convert it into an integer, it gives us an error because strings cannot be manipulated in that type of way. Okay, so we have another in-class exercise. So write a program that prints the user for two numbers and ask the user if they want to add, subtract, multiply, or divide the first and second number, and then print out the result. So make sure to have it in the output should be in decimals. So use the correct conversion function for that. I'll give you like another 6 minutes to do this. Okay, I'll be going over it now. So first, we prompt the user to input a number, and we store that into a variable. I'm calling it first num. And then we prompt the user to input a second number, and I'm storing that into another string variable. We're calling that second num. And then I'm also going to prompt the user if they want to add, subtract, multiply, or divide. And I am storing that into another string variable called operation. Then I'm gonna, since I want to manipulate first num and second num, I'm gonna convert those into a float. So I can get like an exact decimal for when I add, subtract, multiply, or divide.
Listen to her.
And then I have a series of conditional statements. So if the operation string is equal to add, I'll print first num plus second num. Else if the operation is equal to subtract, if that string is equal to subtract, we print first num minus second num. If the operation the string is equal to multiply, we print first num times second num, and then else we print first num divided by second num, since that's the last option. So I'll run this. Say we have 5, and we want to input another one. And we want to multiply them. Our solution is going to be 20, and since these numbers are accepted as floats, it's also going to output our solution as a float.
Someone asked if you could use a double instead of a float.
Double?
Mm.
This is like the only way you can convert a string into like a decimal. And then I also want to talk about nested conditional statements, because I think these could be really useful. And also, I also have homework for you guys that include nested conditional statements. So these are just conditional statements.
You are sure they send the recording, right?
Conditional statement.
I asked you to record the whole class and you said they send every. If they don't send, ಏನು ಮಾಡ್ತೇನೆ ನೋಡ್ ನಾನು.
Please make sure that everybody's microphones are off so we can continue with the class. Thanks. Anjana, you're muted.
So let's say we input a number like 25 or something. So we first have our if statement here. So as you can see, there's an if and else. There are these if else statements that are indented inside this big if statement. So this is a nested if statement. So let's say we input our number as 25. We check if num is divisible by 2, and it's not. So instead of going into these if else statements, we skip this whole entire block and we go into our big else statement. And then that's when we can check these if and else statements. So since 25 is greater than 10, it's going to print odd numbers greater than 10. But let's say we input a number like 6 or something. Since 6 is divisible by 2, it's going to check these if else, this if statement and this else statement. And since 6 is less than 10, this if statement is not true. So we're going to go to our else statement and we're going to print even number less than or equal to 10. So I'm going to show this. Okay. So let's input 25. It's gonna print out odd number greater than 10 because it's not divisible by 2, and it's gonna skip this whole entire block and go to our else statement block and gonna check these nested if else statements. But if we have a number that is divisible by 2, it's gonna check this. This is gonna be true, and it's gonna test these two conditional statements. So can you guys figure out what's gonna be printed in this next example? Yeah, it should be 11. So I think. Okay, so we have our two initialized variables, x is equal to 3 and y is equal to 8. So our first nested if statement asks if y is equal to 3. So since y is equal to 8, this is true, so we're not going to test any of these conditional statements that are indented inside this big if statement. So we're going to go to else. So now we're going to test these individual conditional statements. So if x is equal to 1, it's going to print x. Well, x is not equal to 1, so we're going to skip over that. If x is greater than 2, we're going to print y plus x. So since this is true, we're going to be printing y plus x, which is 11. And then, so yeah, it prints 11. So if it was, let's say like 3, if we put y is equal to 3, it prints 3 because since y is equal to 3, we are going to be testing these conditional statements inside this big one. And since this is not true, y will be printed. And then our homework for this, it's like a little bit longer. Write a program that asks for the user's name, if they want a burger, salad, or pizza, and also if they want a drink with their meal, and prints out their order and price of it. Note, a drink is always a quarter of the price of the meal. So this is a little bit longer and complicated. And I also have just like a simple nested, just like to see what will be run if you print this code. So that's pretty much it. Are there any more questions or anything? Okay, well, the homework's gonna be posted on Google Classroom. Make sure you turn that in on time. Okay, you guys can go now if you want.